All right, let's jump right in. Today we're going deep on the Cold War.
Yeah, great topic.
And we've got some pretty incredible sources for this one. Articles, firsthand accounts,
Right.
even some declassified documents. So
Wow.
yeah, I've been skimming through them, and let's just say it's already got me hooked.
Oh, yeah. It's funny how a war that was called cold could feel so intense, right? I mean,
Wait, Cold
war, no big battles directly between the superpowers, but
Yeah.
the tension, the fear, it was global, and it lasted for, well, what, almost half a century?
Yeah, it's crazy. It's like this paradox, a Cold War that was anything but cold, especially if you were living through it, you know?
Absolutely.
So when we talk about this tension, this global standoff, was it really just as simple as capitalism versus communism?
Well, yeah. I mean, on the surface, yeah, that clash of ideologies between the U.S. and the USSR, that was a huge driver.
Yeah.
But it's really important to remember that these weren't just like ideas being debated, you know?
Yeah.
They were different ways of life,
Yeah.
completely different visions for the future.
Yeah, and like on a personal level even, right? Like imagine living in a world where the state decides what you can buy at the store, like in the Soviet Union.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's so different from how we live, you know?
Yeah. And that difference, that fear of the other, that really fueled a lot of the mistrust, the paranoia, that defined the Cold War.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just like this abstract fear. It had very real consequences. Take Germany, for instance.
Oh, yeah.
A city literally divided by a wall. I mean, can you imagine?
Yeah. Berlin really was like a microcosm of the whole Cold War.
Exactly.
It
Yeah.
was this physical manifestation of that ideological divide.
Right. And from what I've been reading, it wasn't just about the physical barrier.
Wow, not at all.
The psychological impact of the people living there on either side must have been immense.
Oh, absolutely. The Berlin Wall, it wasn't just concrete and barbed wire. It represented a barrier to freedom, to opportunity, to just connecting with loved ones.
Yeah, yeah. And this sense of division, this ideological battle, it wasn't contained to Europe, right?
Mm.
The Korean War comes to mind. It seems like, from what I've read, it was one of the earliest and most brutal examples of how these ideological clashes turned into proxy conflicts all over the world.
Oh, absolutely. Korea became this tragic battleground
Yeah.
where the U.S. and the USSR were essentially fighting their war through other nations,
Right.
and with devastating consequences for the Korean people, of course.
And that's the chilling thing about proxy wars, right?
It is, yeah.
Even though the main players, they're not directly fighting, the human cost, it's very real.
Extremely real, yes.
It makes you think about the leaders who orchestrated these proxy wars.
It does.
What were they thinking? How could they justify the loss of life in a conflict that's technically not even their own?
Yeah. That's something, historians and ethicists are still debating today, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. It's a tough one. And then, of course, there's the constant fear of nuclear annihilation.
Yeah.
Just reading about the arms race, the
Yes.
development of these increasingly powerful weapons. It's hard to believe that humanity didn't just destroy itself.
I know. Sometimes I wonder if it was, well, I don't know, maybe just a sliver of rationality, however fragile, that kept things from going too far.
Maybe.
But the fear, that was very real. Imagine living with that,
Yeah.
knowing that at any moment, everything could just disappear.
I can't even imagine.
It must have been a constant weight, this existential dread hanging over everything.
It's like you're going about your daily life, but there's always this thought in the back of your mind. It
Right.
could all be gone in a flash.
Yeah, and you see that reflected in the culture of the time, too,
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Music, movies, even fashion, it's all infused with this anxiety, this uncertainty.
Yeah, like those images of fallout shelters,
Yeah.
duck and cover drills.
Mhm.
It's almost surreal looking back on it now.
It is, yeah.
But at the time, that was reality for a lot of people.
It was, yeah. And that sense of living on the edge, of teetering on the brink of annihilation, I think that really reached its peak during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah, those 13 days, that felt like an eternity.
It's true.
From what I've read, it was like the whole world was holding its breath as Kennedy and Khrushchev went head to head.
Yeah.
Each one waiting for the other to back down.
It was a terrifying game of chicken.
Yeah, with incredibly high stakes.
No doubt about that.
Soviet missiles in Cuba, capable of hitting the U.S. mainland.
Right.
I mean, it's just incredible that things didn't spiral out of control.
It really is. It makes you wonder, though,
What's that?
How close did we actually come to nuclear war? I mean, was it really as close as we think, or
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, historians still debate it today.
they do?
Some say Khrushchev never intended to launch the missiles, that it was just a bluff that went too far.
A bluff,
Now,
yeah.
others believe we were really on the brink of disaster.
Yeah. But one thing's for sure,
What's that?
the Cuban Missile Crisis was a wake-up call. It showed both sides just how easily things could escalate, how quickly things could go wrong.
Right, right. And it had a lasting impact.
It did.
Like the hotline between Washington and Moscow.
Oh, yeah. The hot
Yeah, it was a direct result of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
was. I mean, they realized they needed a way to communicate directly,
Yeah.
avoid those potential misunderstandings that could lead to something truly terrible.
Right. A small step, but an important one.
Absolutely.
And, in some ways, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a turning point.
Yeah, you could say
A
that.
thawing of relations, this period of
Like that.
decline.
Yeah.
It's like both sides realized that pushing each other to the brink, it wasn't sustainable.
It wasn't, no. When you think about it, it's interesting to consider the individuals involved.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Kennedy, Khrushchev, their personalities, their beliefs. How much did that play into the course of events?
Yeah. It's like, were there missed opportunities for diplomacy? Did personal animosity make things worse?
Right, exactly. It's a question that keeps historians busy, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. It's amazing how even the most well-known events can still have so much depth to uncover.
Oh, absolutely. It's what makes history so fascinating.
I agree. So before we go too far down that rabbit hole, let's get back to the sources you've gathered. See what else we can uncover.
All right, let's do it.
I have a feeling this is just the tip of the iceberg.
I think you're right. So, it's an interesting question, right? Did anyone really win the Cold War?
Yeah. It's easy to look back and say, well, the Soviet Union collapsed, the U.S. is still standing. So,
Right.
But it wasn't that simple, was it? I mean, sure, the U.S. kind of achieved its goal of containing communism.
Yeah.
They came out as the sole superpower. But that victory, it came at a cost.
Oh, absolutely.
Decades of living under this threat of nuclear war.
Right.
The interventions in Korea, Vietnam, all those conflicts.
Yeah.
And then there's the rise of the military-industrial complex, that whole thing.
Yeah, the Cold War had a profound impact on American society, that's for sure, on their policies, foreign relations, even their culture.
Yeah, yeah. And we can't forget about the millions of people who lived under communist rule
Right.
in Eastern Europe, other parts of the world. I mean, their lives were shaped by repression,
Yeah.
economic hardship.
Right. The Cold War wasn't just this abstract ideological struggle between superpowers.
Right.
It had a very real human cost. And for those living behind the Iron Curtain, that cost was, well, it was immense.
Yeah, yeah. It's easy to look back and see as this battle of good versus evil.
Right.
But the reality was much more complex.
Much more.
Both sides made mistakes. They acted out of fear, and sometimes, well, they did some pretty terrible things.
Yeah, it's important to avoid those simplistic labels. What's really interesting, I think, is how fear on both sides
Yeah.
became this driving force.
Mm-hmm.
The fear of communism in the West, the fear of capitalist encirclement in the East.
Yeah.
It shaped policies, fueled the arms race, and ultimately it made the world a much more dangerous place.
It's like this cycle of fear and mistrust, right?
Yeah.
One side does something, the other side sees it as a threat,
Right.
and they respond, and it just escalates.
Escalates, yeah. And I think communication, or rather the lack of it, played a huge role.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, a classic example of how misunderstandings, that lack of direct communication, can almost lead to disaster.
Yeah, yeah. And it makes you think, what lessons can we learn from the Cold War? I mean, are there things we can apply to the world today? Because it seems like there are some parallels to the current geopolitical climate.
Oh, there are. There are definitely parallels. And I think one of the biggest takeaways is the importance of diplomacy.
Right.
Open communication, especially when you're dealing with, well, with adversaries, with people you don't necessarily agree with. The Cuban Missile Crisis showed us that talking, even when it's difficult, is crucial.
It's like that saying, right? You don't have to like someone to negotiate with them.
Exactly.
Sometimes talking is the only way to stop things from getting out of control.
Exactly. Another lesson, and this is a big one, is the danger of unchecked military spending.
Yeah, yeah. The arms race during the Cold War.
It put a huge strain on both the U.S. and Soviet economies. Money that could have gone to education, healthcare, all these important things, it was being poured into weapons.
It's a reminder that peace through strength It comes with a pretty hefty price tag.
It does.
And speaking of that military buildup, there's the whole issue of the military-industrial complex.
Right, right. It's a controversial legacy for sure.
Yeah.
This intertwining of military interests with the economy and politics,
Yeah.
it had a big impact on U.S. policy, and it's still something we're dealing with today.
Yeah, it raises all sorts of questions about national security, democratic accountability, that whole balance.
It does.
So shifting gears a bit, another thing that really struck me about the Cold War is the power of ideas.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, communism might not be the force it once was,
Right.
but there are other ideologies, other forms of extremism out there.
Absolutely. And understanding those ideologies, their history, how they appeal to people,
Yeah.
that's crucial. It's not just about military strength anymore. It's about winning hearts and minds, offering something better than fear and resentment.
It's like we're still grappling with these issues, even though the Cold War ended decades ago.
We are. The Cold War might be over, but its legacy, it continues to shape our world.
It's like a ripple effect,
Yeah, ripple
like
ahead.
echoes of the past influencing the present.
Absolutely. And understanding how it shaped our world, well, that's key to understanding the challenges we face today.
You know, one thing that really hit me while I was going through these sources was the human cost of the Cold War. It's easy to focus on the grand strategies, the political maneuvering,
Right.
but we can't forget that real people were caught in the middle of all this.
Absolutely. Behind the headlines, behind the history books, there were individuals, families, whose lives were turned upside down.
Yeah, yeah.
Opportunities lost because of this global ideological struggle.
I keep thinking about those East Germans trying to escape over the Berlin Wall,
Right.
the families in Korea, Vietnam, caught in those proxy wars,
Yeah.
and the people living under repressive regimes who dared to speak out.
Those people weren't just statistics. They
Right.
weren't pawns in some game. They were real people with hopes and dreams and fears, just like us.
Yeah. It makes the Cold War so much more relatable, I think, when you
Mm.
connect it to the human experience.
It does, yeah.
And it highlights something really important, something that's so relevant today in our world that's becoming more and more polarized.
What's that?
Empathy.
Empathy, yeah. Being able to see the world through someone else's eyes, understanding their perspective, even if you disagree with them.
Exactly.
It doesn't mean you have to condone their actions or beliefs.
Right.
But it's about recognizing that shared humanity that connects us all.
Yeah, yeah. Empathy, it can be a powerful antidote to that us versus them mentality.
The mentality that fueled so much of the Cold War.
Exactly. It allows for understanding, for dialogue, for the possibility of building bridges instead of walls.
It's a reminder that even in times of conflict, our shared humanity should be the guiding principle.
Yeah, yeah. Something to keep in mind as we face our own global challenges today.
Absolutely.
So as we go deeper into these sources, I think it's important to keep that human dimension in mind.
I agree.
It's not just about understanding the events, but also about understanding how those events impacted individuals, families, entire societies.
Right. The human stories, the struggles, the acts of courage,
Yeah.
those are the things that make history come alive.
They really do. And sometimes those stories lead us to unexpected places.
They do.
They challenge our assumptions.
Right.
So as we move into the final part of this deep dive, I'm really curious to see where those stories will take us.
Me too. I'm excited to see what we uncover.
Welcome back for the final part of our Cold War deep dive.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey so far.
It has. We've covered a lot of ground, the ideological battles, the strategies, the human cost.
Right.
But for this last part, I kind of want to dig into some of the lesser-known stories.
Yeah, I like that.
The stuff that often gets overshadowed by the big picture narratives,
Absolutely. There's so much that went on behind the scenes, stuff that we're only just now learning about.
It's like peeling back layers of history, uncovering these hidden stories, these little glimpses into the complexity of the era.
Right, exactly.
It's like we've been looking at the Cold War through this wide-angle lens, and now we're zooming in.
I like that analogy.
Yeah, focusing on the details, the human stories.
Yeah, and one area that's particularly fascinating, I think, is espionage.
Oh, espionage.
Yeah.
It's like something out of a spy novel, right?
It is, yeah. Secret agents, double agents, codes, clandestine meetings, all that.
Right. But the reality of espionage during the Cold War, it was much more complex than any fiction could capture.
Oh, absolutely. And more morally ambiguous, too,
Yeah, yeah. When you think about it, espionage, it wasn't just about stealing secrets, right?
No, that's that.
It was about trying to understand the other side's intentions,
Mm-hmm.
predicting their next move, maybe even influencing events to your advantage.
Exactly. There was a lot of psychological warfare involved,
Right.
disinformation, rumors, discrediting your opponents. It was all part of the game.
Yeah, with incredibly high stakes.
Oh, yeah. A successful intelligence operation, I mean, that could change everything.
Right.
Shift the balance of power, sway public opinion, maybe even prevent a crisis.
One story that really stood out to me from the sources was the case of Oleg Penkovsky,
Oh, Penkovsky, yeah.
this Soviet intelligence officer who became a double agent for the West during, during the most intense years of the Cold War.
It's an incredible story.
It is. Imagine the courage it must have taken to risk everything, to betray your own country.
Yeah, I mean, he truly believed he was doing the right thing.
Right. For the greater good.
He provided vital information to the U.S. and the U.K.,
Yeah.
details about Soviet missiles, which, turned out to be crucial during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right. Yeah.
And, his story, it ended tragically,
It did.
but it really highlights those individual acts of bravery that were happening behind the scenes.
Yeah, yeah. It's a good reminder that history isn't just made by the big names, the presidents and generals,
Right.
Yeah. It's made by ordinary people making extraordinary choices.
Yeah. And speaking of choices, there's the case of the Cambridge Five.
Ah, yes. The Cambridge Five.
This group of British intellectuals who spied for the Soviet Union for decades.
Yeah, it's a story that still fascinates people today.
It does. These were brilliant men educated at the best universities, and yet they chose to betray their country.
Right. And for what? I mean, was it ideology, personal reasons, a bit of both?
It's hard to say for sure. I mean, their motivations, the impact they had, it's still debated today.
Yeah, it's like a psychological puzzle.
It is, yeah.
Trying to understand what would lead someone to do something like that.
It challenges our ideas about loyalty, ideology, and, well, human nature, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. And it shows that the Cold War wasn't always this clear-cut battle of good versus evil.
Right. There were people caught in the middle making choices that we're still trying to make sense of today.
Right, right. It's like those spy novels where you're never quite sure who to trust or what their real agenda is.
Exactly.
But even with all that intrigue and suspicion, there were also these moments of collaboration.
Oh, yeah. It's easy to focus on the conflict, the rivalry.
Right.
But there were times when the U.S. and the Soviet Union actually found common ground.
Yeah, like they realized that working together, at least in some areas, was in everyone's best interest.
Exactly. Like the Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975.
Ah, yes. American and Soviet astronauts shaking hands in space.
A powerful image, right?
It was. Their spacecraft docking together, this symbol of détente.
Yeah. And it wasn't just symbolic. I mean, there was real scientific collaboration, sharing of knowledge.
Right, right. They realized that some challenges, they go beyond ideology.
They do.
And it wasn't just space exploration either.
Right.
There was collaboration on scientific research, environmental protection, even cultural exchanges.
Yeah. These little glimmers of light in the darkness.
Yeah, reminders that even in the midst of global tension, human connection can still find a way.
It can. And those moments, however small, they offer a valuable perspective.
To do?
They remind us that even enemies, even people who seem completely opposed, can find ways to work together.
Yeah. And that's a lesson that's more relevant than ever today, I think.
Absolutely. Climate change, global pandemics, these are challenges that require global cooperation.
Exactly. The Cold War might be over.
Right.
But the lessons we can learn from it, they're still relevant.
Absolutely. It was a defining era. It shaped the world we live in today.
Yeah, it did.
Mm-hmm.
And understanding it, really digging into its nuances, its contradictions,
Right.
I think it helps us understand ourselves better. It helps us understand the challenges we face today.
I think so, too.
It's been an incredible journey exploring the Cold War, all its different facets.
It has.
And I've learned a lot, not just about history, but about human nature, about the choices we make.
Yeah, and the consequences of those choices, how they ripple through time.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important to keep these insights with us.
I agree.
These lessons of history, these glimpses of humanity's capacity for both conflict and cooperation.
Let's remember the past, not to dwell on it, but to learn from it.
Yeah, yeah.
To help us navigate the complexities of our own time.
Well said. That's a wrap on our Cold War deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and keep exploring.